Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for April 15th, 2022. As it's Friday, I'm going to take a question, and I'm going to take a question that's been asked of me by many people. And I'll give an answer based on the idea of why it's necessary to really know history. The question is, you live in Germany, you've been there for a while. Why are the Germans supporting the British and American and NATO war against Russia? Why is it that they're submitting to the demand to arm Ukraine, to support sanctions against Russia, which hurt German industry and the German population, and that by cutting off necessary oil and gas imports from Russia are going to damage German industry? Why would they do that? Now, there is a sort of simple answer, which is that you have an unstable coalition government. It's very weak. You have the FDP, the liberals, and the social democrats, who are sort of the socialists. They don't get along on virtually anything. And then you have the crazy Greens, who want to shut down German industry and at the same time fight wars. But the answer actually can be found more clearly by looking at history. So that's what I'm going to do. Tomorrow is an important date in German history. 100 years ago tomorrow, on April 16th, 1922, a treaty was signed between Russia and Germany in the Italian town of Rapallo. And it became known since then as the Rapallo Treaty. The people who signed it were the German Foreign Minister Walter Ratnau and the Russian Foreign Minister Georgy Chicherin. Now, one of the principal causes, if not the main cause of World War I, was the British geopolitical doctrine, which insisted that there could be no alliances allowed between Western European nations and Russia. That the idea that you could have an alliance between France, Germany, and Russia that could link up through the Trans-Siberian Railroad with China was an existential threat to Britain's control over international trade and finance. And going back to 1904 with Halford Mackinder's geographical pivot of history, the argument was that if the Eastern European heartland, which included Russia and included Eurasia, were ever to link up as an integrated economic unit, it would threaten and destroy the power of the British naval force to control the trade and finance of the world. And so that was something which absolutely could not be allowed. And to a large extent, World War I was organized to prevent that from happening, to prevent a Franco-German-Russian alliance, which could then link up to Eurasia and then to China. Now, after the war, there was an effort to sustain that, in fact, to make that a permanent condition, that is an anti-German, in particular, relationship in which Russia and France would be brought in. The problem was there was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the Soviet Union was not so interested in forming or adhering to the demands of the British royalty. And at the same time, the suppression of Germany was resisted by especially industrialists inside Germany. So the concern was that after the war, both of these empires had collapsed, and Germany, under reparations, was cut off from exporting to the West, and Russia was isolated. Now, there was some fear, especially among the French and some of the British, that the reparations against Germany were too harsh. And so in April 1922, a conference was pulled together of 34 nations, including Russia and Germany, that met in Genoa, Italy, to discuss, is there some way to keep the basic form of the Versailles Agreement, but lessen the punishment of Germany? Now, there was no way to get an agreement there because the French representative, the Prime Minister Poincaré, was opposed to letting up at all. In fact, he wanted harsher sanctions against Germany. So while they were negotiating this agreement, while there was a fight going on, the Germans and Russians met secretly in Rapallo. Walter Ratnau was the chairman of AEG, which was the German electronics firm that had been built by his father. During World War I, he was essentially the war minister. He was in charge of making sure that the industrial processes went smoothly so that the war could be fought. He became foreign minister with an alliance which included industrialists, but also support from the very powerful German labor movement. Now, both the Germans and the Russians feared economic domination by France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Germany wanted raw materials from Russia, and also they wanted Russia to be an export market for their products. And the Russians wanted German investment in their economy and also technical expertise. In the Soviet Union at this point, Lenin made a shift away from world revolution to what was called the New Economic Plan, which was based on bringing in new technologies, especially electrification, improvements in agriculture, and they needed the expertise and capabilities that the Germans could provide. So you had a potential then for an alliance that would be beneficial to both countries. In order to get this agreement, the Germans recognized the Soviet government as legitimate, and they were the first major nation to do so. They also relinquished claims to confiscated property, lands that had been and property that had been seized by the Bolsheviks. In return, the Russians renounced the right to collect reparations from Germany, and they agreed the trade would be conducted under the most favored nation status agreement. This treaty was signed April 16th, 1922. Immediately, there was an explosion of outrage from France and Britain. Lloyd George, the former prime minister who was doing the negotiations for Britain, joined with Poincaré, who was the French prime minister, in denouncing it, and they shut down the Genoa Conference. Now, this pointed in an interesting direction. Did these two nations have the right to reach an agreement that was beneficial to both nations? That was not a military alliance, although there are reports that the Russians were going to allow the Germans to use some industry and factories in Russia to rebuild their military. But it was primarily economic. Germany had been badly damaged in World War I, and the reparations were causing them to print money to pay the debt. Well, what happened just more than 2 months later, on June 24th, 1922, Walter Ratnau was assassinated. And from that time forward, while the form of the agreement was kept, the substance was never really fulfilled. The people blamed for the assassination were, quote, right-wing terrorists connected to something called the Organization Consul. Now, think about this in the context of German history. An assassination sabotaged a potential for Russia and Germany to collaborate for mutually beneficial economic relations. 67 years later, after World War II, after the communist domination of Eastern Europe, including East Germany, the Berlin Wall fell. And the question at that point was, how could you conduct a peaceful reunification of East and West? This is somewhat of an issue today because of the whole questions raised by Putin of the West promise not to extend NATO eastward, a promise that they have repeatedly broken. But here's the other side of it, the economic side. When the wall fell, Lyndon and Helga Zeppler-Rouge immediately made proposals for what they called the Industrial Triangle, a plan to use industry from the area between Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, where you had some of the most high-tech industries in the world, to be brought in to help develop the Russian economy, to bring in the necessary technology to then mesh with the already skilled labor force to give the Russians a way to make a transition from a failed communist state to a prosperous European state. One of the proponents for an idea that was parallel to the LaRouche's plan was a man named Alfred Herrhausen, who was the chairman of Deutsche Bank. And Herrhausen had just drafted a proposal that was very much compatible with what the LaRouches were proposing. Well, on November 30th, 1989, Herrhausen was assassinated. This time, it was supposedly done by the Red Army faction, allegedly left-wing terrorists. Now, these are left-wing terrorists in the sense that their origins can be traced back to something called Operation Gladio, which is a NATO operation which after the Cold War, first of all, after the end of World War II, incorporated Nazi intelligence networks into Western intelligence. And then after the collapse of communism, increasingly brought in ex-Stasi agents and others under their wing and became an assassination bureau during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Herrhausen's assassination, along with 2 or 3 other assassinations, put an end to the German effort to offer a cooperative plan for developing the Russian economy. And instead, the British and the Americans sent in a team of banker hitmen to dismantle the Russian economy, to tear down its industry, to loot the physical resources of the country. And this was people like Bill Browder, Jeffrey Sachs, the economist from, I think, Harvard at the time. And instead, Russia was plunged into a tremendous crisis, a demographic crisis, because it was not able to produce enough wealth to sustain its population. So when we look at this history, the right-wing terrorists killing Ratnau, destroying the potential for the Rapallo Treaty, the murder of Herrhausen after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Do you think German Chancellor Scholz knows this history? I'm sure he does. Do you think people around him know this history? Remember, Scholz initially was opposed to escalated sanctions, was opposed to German rearmament of Ukraine. But that changed. Does this history play a role in that? I can't tell you for sure, but I suspect it does. And that's why it's important to know real history from the inside. And that's a lesson from Lyndon LaRouche, who always insisted that you have to know the history of nations and know them from the standpoint of human nature to know what you're dealing with. And what we're dealing with the British Empire, whether it was from the pre-World War II formation of the empire, or today as the Anglo-American Empire, it maintains this hostility to Russia, not just because of Russia, but because of what an alliance between Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Eurasia would represent to the banking and financial forces of the Anglo-American world. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back with you on Monday.